They've influenced so much of popular culture in terms of the musical movements that followed. If you think of the Pretenders, you think of R.E.M., you think of the Smiths, or Tom Petty. That's just a small example. Teenage Fan Club. There are so many acts that have benefited from what the Byrds did.
Because it had that unique chiming 12-string sound and a sort of like folk thing, and a guy who kind of looked like Ben Franklin, and it was not the typical rock and roll picture. There was something really different about it.
You can't really pin them down, you know? It's not just folk rock, it's not just country rock, it's not just psychedelia. That one band did all that is their legacy, and that's, you know, I mean, that's a rich legacy to have.
George Harrison, Ringo Starr, John Lennon, Paul McCartney.
(1964) and Beatlemania hits America. The hysteria that surrounded the arrival of the Beatles and the subsequent influx of British bands, popularly known as the British Invasion, left American music beleaguered, uncertain, and desperate to find an answer to the sudden and drastic change of status quo.
The arrival of the Beatles had just upended everything on the American musical scene. I mean, there suddenly was this incredible Anglophilia, and so anything from England, you know, quickly, you know, the Rolling Stones came over, the Animals came over, the Zombies came over. There was this sense of this flood of bands, and it just really overwhelmed, you know, everything that was on the American music scene.
We just were in awe of them. They were so good. They'd put out a song like Paperback Writer, and I'd want to just give up, because I could never do that. I could never get close to that.
The British invasion really knocked the recording industry in the United States for a total loop. It came out of total left field, and the Beatles and then the bands that came in just after them were dominating the business. A lot of record companies were looking for their version of the Beatles.
It was this search that would ultimately lead to the formation of the Byrds. But prior to finding each other, the three founding members of the band, Roger McGuinn, David Crosby and Gene Clark, had been plying their trade within the various touring groups of the commercial folk scene. Though limited in scope, performing within a folk combo provided aspirational musicians with a stable platform from which to launch a career.
Well, one of the interesting things is that the Byrds don't really come out of rock and roll. They come out of this, frankly, rather naff world of commercial American folk, Chad Mitchell Trio, so on, you know, wearing these slightly preppy, almost uniforms, and it's that in itself is a long way from Dylan and Beatnik chic in Greenwich Village.
When they were trying to make it as folk musicians, there were a few ways they could have gone to make a successful career out of it. One was to play hootenannies, open mic sessions is what we might call them today, and hope to get noticed perhaps by a manager like Albert Grossman, or perhaps get noticed by someone who was leading a folk combo or group, as Roger McGuinn had by the Chad Mitchell Trio.
It got around, you know, that McGuinn could accompany you on guitar or banjo or whatever, and his real break, I guess, came when he was allowed to be part of the Chad Mitchell Trio. Only accompanying him in the background. He wasn't like, you know, he wasn't in the trio, obviously. They were out front and he was kind of at the back just helping them out. But although he was a junior member as such in the Kid, I think he was known as Skinny McGuinney at the time, he was with them for quite a long time. I mean, I think it was about 2.5 years he was with them. And they toured extensively, and he got tremendous experience from that.
And now, from the world of folk music, the Chad Mitchell Trio.
oxen roars to wake the dead. Come and get your oats, me son. Whoop, jamboree, whoop, jamboree, big round fat man, come up.
The Chad Mitchell Trio were reasonably well known. I don't think they were in the highest echelon of all, but they were certainly, you know, making reasonable money touring. They were known on the folk circuit. It was a very secure job to get. But the purist folkies wouldn't have you know, been particularly enamoured of the Chad Mitchell Trio because, you know, partly because they were making decent money, I guess, as much as anything.
Come and get your roast, me son. Hey, yep. Oh, when we get to the Blackpool...
I met, his name was Jim McGuinn. I met him when he was working with Chad Mitchell and the Chad Mitchell Trio earlier, and I met him when he was wearing Madras jackets and so forth. Really nifty, preppy, really nifty. Beautiful man, had it down. Penny loafers, man of great distinction.
He was never completely satisfied with the Chad Mitchell Trio because he didn't regard them as kind of sincere folkies. I mean, there wasn't a great deal of authenticity there. They were a commercial, you know, folk group.
Yeah! Come on, Big Mule, let's roll 'em out now. We head for Denver.
While a reluctant McGuinn continued to sell his labour to industrialised folk, the Madras-jacketed procession of touring bands and revue shows had provided shelter for another burgeoning but frustrated musical talent.
Gene Clark had a not dissimilar history to McGuinn, except that he was in a more obscure part of America, which was, of course, in Kansas, Missouri. And one day the new Christy Minstrels hit town, as it were. You know, he was seen in a local group. He'd been playing in a couple of local groups, and he was spotted. And I think, you know, Randy Sparks, who ran this whole new Christy Minstrels conglomeration, was always looking for, you know, for new players.
Now all you young fellers, take warning. You think all the men for your life. Be careful and stay out of Denver, or else you'll wind up from a wife. Yeah. You walk down the street unsuspecting, and you won't believe what you see. But the free that live in Denver, Lord, you end up happy like me.
Gene Clark wasn't like the lead guy in the new Christy Minstrels or anywhere near it. I mean, I think he found it rather awkward. I mean, Gene Clark could be quite a gregarious personality, but he's also capable of being very withdrawn, and he was still quite young at this time. There was a large turnover in the new Christy Minstrels, and they even had a junior group that was a feeder group for them. So, you know, it's kind of like almost joining a community when you join the new Christy Minstrels or one of the feeder groups.
Oh, Tory, roll the junk ashore, please.
They were touring, and he was in a place, and the Beatles were playing in the jukebox, and he heard the Beatles, and it was one of those road to Damascus moments, and he kept putting dimes in the jukebox to hear She Loves You again and again and again and again and again, and decided that's what I want to do. It was a great sense of freedom. And of course, McGuinn experienced a similar sense of freedom when he heard the Beatles, and that simultaneously, you know, almost parallel to all this is that you know, he's been through his scene. McGuinn's been through the folk thing with the Chad Mitchell Trio, which is almost analogous to the new Christy Minstrels. And these were young kids who thought it was all a bit straight and wanted to move away from that.
Here's a recommendation from me, Jack Linkletter, to you. Get this great new Hootenanny 64 album from Texas. It features top folk artists, many of whom have appeared on Hootenanny. Hear Flat and Scruggs singing This Land Is Your Land. Bobby Dylan's Freight Train Blues. Johnny Cash on Chain Gang. I'll Fly Away with Carolyn Hester. The new Christy Minstrels Rovin' Ramblers. And many more top hits by America's top folk artists. Yours in one big LP album, not for $3.98, not for $1.98, but for a single $1 bill.
Then the Beatles come along, and change everything. So this sort of 1950s preppy commercial folk thing goes out the window, and a good job too.
You think you've lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday. It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. She said she loves you, and you know that can't be bad. If she loves you, and you know you should be glad.
The Beatles were everywhere, and you cannot overestimate the impact of the Beatles on America at that time. I mean, when they arrived in January '64 and appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, everything changed overnight. I mean, you know, the Beatles was what every kid wanted to be in the nation. They had the top 5 singles on Billboard, number 1 through to 5. And a load of other singles in the top 40.
Though McGuinn and Clark both had ambitions to write and perform their own music, circumstances had obscured the path of the successful folk musician. The emergence of a young Bob Dylan had revived critical interest in the genre, but many of the more authentic folk voices were raised in loud argument over the role of electricity, while their traditional certainties creaked under the beat of the British invasion.
I found that folk music had numbered days. And that was when I heard the Beach Boys being screamed at down the peninsula, Balboa Peninsula, and another place. I was in the prison of Socrates with the vestiges of the beat era. And down the street I could hear the mournful moan of the electric guitar. And I knew my days as a folk musician were numbered.
It suddenly began to feel very outdated. You know, there was a feeling like, you know, something new was happening. You know, the folk scene had historically been, you know, very condescending about pop music. You know, there was, you know, a sense that, you know, folk musicians were serious and they thought about serious things, and they were literary, and they were political, and pop music was dismissible and contrived. But the Beatles had turned all that upside down, because the Beatles were clearly smart. These